From Battleborn Progress, this is Out in Front. I'm your host, Jacob Solis. This week, you've probably heard of Project 2025. You might already know it's been called a blueprint for a second Trump administration. Inside Project 2025 are over 900 pages of conservative ideology that would radically reshape the U.S. government. Cutting federal agencies, sometimes cutting them completely, eliminating crucial programs and putting unfettered power in the hands of radical Christian conservatives who want to regulate every tiny bit of American life. Drafted by Trump administration alumni, the hundreds of pages of Project 2025 were crafted by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank that has been at the radical fringe of this country's conservative movement since the Nixon administration. In July, Heritage Foundation head Kevin Roberts said, and I quote, "We are in the process of a second American revolution, and that this revolution," and again, this is a direct quote, "will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be." You might have also seen this news this week that former President Donald Trump suddenly wants nothing to do with Project 2025, even though Project 2025 has a lot to do with him. He said that he doesn't know who's behind it, even though a CNN analysis found 140 former Trump administration officials helped write it, including the man who crafted this year's Republican Party platform. But 900 pages is quite objectively a lot of pages. So we wanted to sit down with some Nevada experts to drill down into the specifics and get a sense of how the pages of Project 2025 could impact Nevada under a hypothetical Trump presidency. But it's actually so much to cover that we've split it into 2 episodes. This week, you'll hear from speakers on labor rights, the environment, and education. In 2 weeks, on August 22nd, we'll hear about the risks to abortion and LGBTQ plus rights. But without further ado, let's get to the rest of the show. Next up, we wanted to dig into some of what Project 2025 has to say about climate and environmental policy, including some of the more outlandish proposals about the weather, but more on that later. For all of that, we turn to Camelot Todd, Communications Director at the Nevada Conservation League. Camelot, thanks so much for joining Out in Front.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely fun topic to start with today, Project 2025 and the environment. And I guess, like all these interviews, I think I want to start big. And one of the big things it proposes, is getting rid of basically the 2 major legislative accomplishments of this last presidential administration, Biden-Harris, and that is the big bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which had massive climate elements, including, I think, unprecedented climate investment in the IRA in particular. So when we talk about repealing those bills, I mean, what does that even mean?
Oh, that's a great question. So both of those bills together are what NCL has branded as the Clean Energy Plan. And they are a series of funding that happens both at the state level, but also at a consumer-based level. So one of those things is the tax credits for buying a new EV or updating your home to more energy efficient standards as far as your HC goes or your heat pump goes. In addition, though, that funding has brought in a lot of new businesses that wouldn't have otherwise started focusing on clean energy, including Unimax in Sloan in Las Vegas, which employs thousands of people with good paying jobs, good paying factory jobs. So when you divest that is destabilizing a whole slew of funding that went in at the consumer level, at the job level, but also at the state level.
Yeah, it's something of a rug pull here. And really what I want, and we talked about this a little earlier in the show, but it's the question of who benefits from these changes, right? And I think in particular, when we talk about this divestment from these clean energy proposals, there is one industry perhaps that benefits more than others. So what is it about the fossil fuel industry that Project 2025 seems to love so much? I mean, why is it that there's this focus, I think, on a pro-fossil fuel agenda here?
I mean, pro-fossil fuel, those companies make a lot of money, and that money tends to fund certain politicians campaigns. So I think it has to do with not helping the American people, not helping Nevadans, but helping themselves. And that's not necessarily what government should be for. You shouldn't enrich yourself as a politician. You should serve the public.
Absolutely. And I mean, when we talk then about the sort of climate goals, we're not talking about climate goals that exist because they're fun or whatever, right? We're talking about potentially catastrophic climate impacts years down the road. I mean, even now we're seeing the impacts of climate change. And look, I'm in Vegas. It's extremely hot all the time. So, like, if we don't rather if there isn't this continued investment at the federal level in these climate programs in an effort to change the United States' carbon footprint rather, what are the consequences long term of that kind of divestment that we've been talking about?
Yeah, yeah. I'm also in Vegas. I'm from here. And the we're talking about billions of dollars in funding for Nevada specifically, right? So we already broke historic records of 120 degrees in July. We're still having triple digit heat waves. We have, the water crisis at Lake Mead. We have the air quality that happens from wildfires. We're also a state that's really unique. The vast majority of our state is public lands, which is federally mandated lands. So we are at this really interesting point of influx where we're seeing the impact of climate change in real life as it's happening here, but we can also be the leaders of a cleaner, healthier, better, environment. We have untapped, solar potential. We have some of the best water conservation efforts that, anywhere in the Southwest you could find. So it's this challenge of, if we lose these funds, do we go down a path quite quickly where the people who are going to be most impacted are the people on the ground? The people who work at our casinos, who make sure the strip is a world destination because they can't work well in environments that are unsustainably hot.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing I wanted to ask about here is, you know, I think I've seen maybe we'll say conservatives have argued that like, okay, if climate change is such a problem, then surely the private investors or the private sector will figure it out and they'll invest. But frankly, what happened in the past 5 years is once we saw the Inflation Reduction Act create all these incentives for private companies to actually invest in this we'll call it in these clean technologies and all this kinds of stuff in all these new projects, only then, right, only after the IRA did all this money pour in. So do we have a sense of, I guess, the necessity? Actually, let me phrase it this way. Obviously Project 2025 wants to roll all this back.
Yeah.
But certainly the IRA is a great starting point. What do you think needs to happen next? What ought to be happening at the federal level to really, I think, address some of the biggest climate crises that are happening right now?
Ooh, so I would say that depends on the state that you live in, right? Because how the climate crisis is impacting the South is very different than how it is impacting, Nevada, California, Arizona, right? And there's a few things that I think would be really great for us to do, which is set a standard for indoor temperature. So on the residential level, right, you can't have your utilities shut off if it's above like 100 or 90 degrees in Nevada. But that doesn't necessarily correlate to people who are disproportionately impacted by these heat waves having the funds to turn on their AC. So that's a little policy change that I think would be really effective that can happen at the federal level, is ensuring that um, indoor heating requirements are already a thing, but also indoor cooling requirements should be a thing. I think that we could also look into mandating that parking lots have solar attachments on it, that bus stations are covered in places where extreme heat is happening. So there's a lot of like little structural changes that I think would be really great to make our society more adaptable to climate change. Building out the EV charging stations. So it's not just Tesla, but it's also a few other companies that are rolling out EVs maybe a little bit slower, but so that they can have access to those charging stations would be a wonderful thing. And I know that there was some federal funding for that as well.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of great ideas, ideas not contemplated by Project 2025, because you know what they are
Yeah.
contemplating? Getting rid of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the National Weather Service, which, Camelot, I have to ask, what's going on here? Why are we getting rid of the weather?
We're not getting what, no. The weather is still going to be a thing, and it is one of the strangest aspects of Project 2025 that I find, because so many people rely on that to ensure that they are physically safe during flooding or wildfires or extreme heat, or to prepare for these climate change crises that are happening via extreme weather, right? So if you get rid of that national system that is free and accessible to the public, what are you replacing it with, and what are the standards? How do you ensure those standards, and how do you make sure that that is something that is accessible for everyone, so that we can properly prepare for these climate change crises as they happen? And I don't think that is answered.
Yeah, I think frankly the implication, I've seen some reporting on this, that they want to just essentially privatize weather forecasting, which boggles the mind as someone who recently watched Twisters in theaters. I can't imagine having to pay a subscription to see if a tornado is going to eat me or not. But Project 2025, that's what they're on. So I guess with that, we'll have to leave it there. Camelot Todd, Nevada Conservation League, I really appreciate you coming on.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, first up, we wanted to zoom into what Project 2025 has to say about labor rights, workers' rights, and unions, how all those policies might spiral outward. For that, we have Angel Sandoval. He is the media relations manager with For Our Future Nevada. Angel, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for having me. This is a really good segment that you've been working on. I've seen a couple of the other videos, and it's really important for us to be informed so that during this election cycle, we can make an informed decision.
Absolutely, absolutely. And frankly, on this element of Project 2025, what I wanted to dig into were some of the specific proposals that they've made about the Department of Labor. I know everyone loves talking about alphabet soup agencies, but with this one in particular, a lot of what Project 2025 has done is said, let's strip back the power of the federal government. Let's remove the ability of these federal agencies to do things, to enact regulations. What's interesting about the labor piece of this, and here's what I want to ask, is they have added actually more agency to the Department of Labor, and they want to do that by giving more power to more political appointees, not bureaucrats, not appointed positions or regular hires, right? Political appointees. So what happens to a federal agencies when you start sort of politicizing it from the inside out?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about. I love this question. This is a great question. Let me tell you a little bit about that. Talking about the history of this, like you already touched a little bit about what Project 2025 is and who are the people that have been working on this project. I want to mention that the person that actually wrote the section on the Department of Labor is Jonathan Berry, which I don't know, for a lot of people, this name might not be that easy to remember, but he acted as the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Labor under the previous administration, under ex-President Donald Trump's administration. Now, why is this important? This goes with the idea that a lot of like extremist Republicans are having, where they, instead of listening to actual people that were vetted and that were appointed through the regular process, during the Trump administration, we started seeing a lot of these like policy secretaries, which was people that was selected by the former president, and that had a lot of power over people that would actually need to be vetted and need to be actually going through a specific channel to make sure that they are the right fit to accomplish the needs that are in the different departments that we have in our government. Now, like you mentioned, that is something that we are seeing within the Project 2025 agenda. And it's something that's really sad. The part that is about the Department of Labor, it's almost 40 pages long. And unfortunately, we haven't heard a lot of people talking about this. This is something that will affect our middle class the most, will affect workers, because the proposals that we have in this section are very harsh, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and I guess let's start getting into, I think, the meat of this, because when we talk about, like, okay, these proposals are very harsh, I think a lot of it is people might take for granted some of the things that have sort of been baked into U.S. labor law over the last century, over the last century and a half. So, what are some of the things that really stood out to you when you're going through those 40 pages? Where do those red flags raise?
Well, let me start by saying that it's really funny that the section about the Department of Labor starts talking a lot about critical race theory, which you might not think that would be like the first focus of this section. However, the reason why they're focusing on that is because they are proposing a limitation on anti-discrimination lawsuits. Uh, this would mean that a worker that is terminated and considers that it's because an act of discrimination, um, it's going to be harder for them to fight this, to go through the through a lawsuit and actually get some responses. Um, some of the most notable things are definitely the weakening, or the proposal of weakening of unions. Also, we have the proposal of limiting and not adding more funds to OSHA, which we know is really, really important to make sure that the working conditions for our workers are um, as safe and secure as possible, considering their health. And there's a lot of like different little sections just like this that uh, make it a little bit hard to understand who are we trying to help with this plan. Obviously, when we're talking about the reduction of the power for unions, we know that the main goal is to give power to big corporations. It's not to give the power to the workers so that they can defend their rights and they can get better pay, better minimum wage, more benefits. That's what a union does. That's what like that's the heart and the soul of a union. They're there to protect the rights of the workers, and by following some of these proposals, we're weakening unions. And actually, one of the sections, now that I just remember, it's recommending to pass a bill that was introduced by Senator Marco Rubio. This bill is called the Teamwork for Employees and Managers Act, which the name sounds very like, oh yeah, let's all work together. However, this bill, what it's trying to do is to weaken a section of the National Labor Relations Act that bans company-controlled unions. What this would mean is that in exchange, workers would have the option to be a part of an employee involvement organization. What does this even mean? As we know, unions are independent from the organizations. However, when we have a company controlled union or these like employee involvement organizations, um, this is just benefiting the big corporations. Why? Because they can have the option to not listen to the suggestions that this union is giving, and they also have a non-voting seat on the boards of these big companies. So this team act, instead of making it like working together, is like only helping big corporations. And it's very, very sad, specifically when we have had such a strong support by the Biden Harris administration. um, as you probably heard, back in 2021, there was a bill proposed, which is the PRO Act, which would make it easier for workers to unionize and make it harder for employers to interfere with union activities. So at the end of the day, we need to protect these unions, because the unions are the ones that are protecting the workers' rights. And actually, there's been studies that show that even for employees that are not part of a union, when you have a union in place, they also get benefits.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, to this point, you said, who really benefits from these proposals in the Project 2025 thing. I think you've laid it out here, right? We talk about who benefits from weakening these sort of like diversity protections, and specifically, who's allowed to sue, for instance, right? If there's a sort of wrongful termination, or someone's being harassed in the workplace for their identity, be it race or gender, or whatever it is, right? Who benefits but the employer, who no longer has to bear the burden of those legal costs of getting sued, right? Who benefits from unions being weakened, and then you get these employee involvement organizations instead doing all the bargaining, right? It sounds like what Project 2025, frankly, would love is if the fox ran the hen house. So what I guess, just to put a bow on all this, I mean, what should a normal person take away from the labor section? I mean, what's the real risk here?
Well, like you mentioned it really clearly, the real risk are workers' rights. That's at the end of it all, that is what is at risk right here. Uh, the middle class, because the middle class, all of us in the middle class, like we're workers. We are workers that, if possible, we can be a part of a union that can fight for our rights, that can fight to improve our benefits and improve our worker conditions. So I would say everyone that is listening that has a job that can be unionized, it could be any type of job. Like, let's remember, another thing that I really like mentioning is, like, with the Biden Harris administration, we have passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has helped create millions of jobs in many areas that are union eligible, like construction. I'm pretty sure you've heard in the last couple of years how we have been talking a lot about the bullet train that's going to be connecting California to Las Vegas. That is a job that has been able to stay alive, and it's going to be able to start thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. And it will be able to provide a job for people that have a union. Unionized jobs are the ones that are protecting the safety conditions at work of all of these employees. That's another thing. One of the parts of Project 2025, they are trying to cut the power and also the funding for OSHA, which we know, specifically after coming out of a pandemic, OSHA is so important, so that we make sure that when we go to work, if we are in any type of condition that can put our health at risk, we are being protected as much as possible. Obviously, accidents happen, and they happen everywhere. However, I remember my grandma always said, better be safe than sorry. It's always best to be attaching to all of the regulations that OSHA has already looked and already realizes that it's what we need to avoid accidents as much as possible. So that is one of the things that I would like to say. Like, every single person, if you're listening and you have the opportunity to be in a job that can be unionized, Project 2025 is threatening your rights. So I would say, read more about this. This was just like a little taste. There's still many other sections. Keep watching these videos, these segments that you guys have put together, so that we know about what is at stake and we can make an informed decision. And if you are like, hey, you know what, I want to do more, I would totally say reach out to organizations like ours. We need volunteers. We need people to go out, talk to people, and help us spread the word of what is at stake, and also how can we help, how can we make sure that we avoid all of these issues.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a great place to end. Angel Sandoval for Our Future Nevada. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Next up, let's talk about education. Project 2025 has a lot to say about education, much of it designed to undermine or otherwise dismantle the country's public education systems. To break down why that would be a disaster, we have Alex Marks, Director of Strategy for the Nevada State Education Association. Alex, how you doing?
I'm great. Great to have me. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining. And yeah, obviously, really big chunk of Project 2025 is directed toward education. And like other sections, I think one of the main thrusts is sort of dismantling the federal infrastructure that's been built up around education or around any issue area, right? And in this case, right, it's the Department of Education. And Project 2025, one of the big things is let's just get rid of the Department of Education. And I think for a lot of normal people, the Department of Education is not something you interact with in the way that like you interact with the IRS, right? So like when we talk about what it means to get rid of a department like this, what are we talking about?
You said it best. I think, this is one of those departments that exists that most people don't think about or even know about until it's gone. So, the Trump-Vance Project 2025 is the MAGA playbook for another Trump presidency. And this is an institutionalized Trumpism, if you will. And part of that includes the elimination of the Department of Education. So the very first sentence of the education section in Project 2025 actually calls for the elimination of this department. This is the only federal agency exclusively focused on children. They always say you lead with the most important goal. You say the first thing that's the most important, and that's why this is the first thing they list. So when you always lead with the most important goal, that's why this is the very first thing in there. This agency works to ensure that every single student, no matter their color, where they live, what language they speak at home, how much their parents make, it ensures that they have access to a great public school in this country. This department it's a critical champion, I guess, in enforcing federal statutes that, prohibit discrimination. They ensure students have access to education that, helps everybody get to their full potential. And Trump's Project 2025 wants to get rid of all of that. And there couldn't be a bigger contrast between candidates, between, Trump and Harris. They, rather than taking away measures that protect students and, protect them from discrimination rather, and get rid of programs that harm our students or help our students rather, Vice President Harris is going to continue to invest in public education as she has throughout her career and advocate for, increases in teacher pay or just ensuring that every student has what they need. The Biden-Harris administration has delivered time and time again with the American Rescue Plan is a great example of this. We can count on that continued leadership, and that's one more reason to vote for a President Harris administration.
Yeah, I want to dig into some of the why of this, right? Because talking about, like you mentioned, this is the Trump playbook. As much as we've seen the Trump campaign try to distance itself from Project 2025, obviously constructed by former Trump administration officials, the Heritage Foundation has been tied at the hip with the conservative movement for literally decades, right? Going back to Reagan. So talking about, I think, through multiple segments this week, the viewers may recognize a theme, right? The sort of who benefits from all of these proposals. When we talk about who benefits from the sort of removal of the government from public schools, right? Or rather, the de-emphasization of the public school system, it's in favor of the private school system. And we just had this fight in Nevada, so I guess we can all tie it back. But like these private schools are, they're mostly religious, right? There's almost zero accountability for what they're actually teaching, what's in these curriculums. And yet, right, stuff like Project 2025 here contemplates this massive shift of public money, of taxpayer dollars towards these private institutions. And I'm curious on your take. What is the consequence of this shift of moving away from public schools toward private schools?
Yeah, it's a reimagining of what public education is or should be. You've heard the Nevada State Education Association probably say a million times, public money belongs in public schools, or hashtag public money, public schools. And this is exactly why, because Project 2025 calls for a national school voucher, which would force tens of thousands of public schools to close. That would cut educator jobs. It would increase our class sizes or quite frankly, just eliminate services offered to our students. So that's one of the reasons why these folks want to do that. They don't believe in public schools. That's why part of Project 2025 is specifically naming the National Education Association and other unions. If they can, diminish the voice of the educator unions, you're going to have an easier time because there's not anybody fighting against it. And that's what we exist to do. Our students need leaders who prioritize their needs and well-being. So instead of workers, instead of taking money out of public schools, a great example, again, Vice President Harris worked to invest in them. She cast the tie-breaking vote for the American Rescue Plan. That was the single largest investment in public education in U.S. history. Nevada got over $1 billion from that package. She is a staunch supporter of public schools. She's voted against these voucher measures. And we've seen a lot of these voucher measures in Nevada. Whether it was last session, we had AB 400 that would have moved hundreds of millions of dollars to unaccountable voucher schemes. We're the only educator union in the entire state opposing such a measure. But, we've always said if a parent can afford to send their child to public or private school, great. The public should not be paying for those religious institutions that are unaccountable to the taxpayer. This again is a reimagining of what they believe public schools should be. 90% of our students are going to end up in a public school. And I shouldn't even say end up. They will go to a public school. So that's why we have to invest in that system. The system does work if you invest in it. The folks who support Project 25 don't really want to invest in it. And that's clear in the multiple pages in that document.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, talking about, I think, and I guess both circling back to something you mentioned, and I think zooming into some of what feel like small indignities in Project 2025, but that have real consequences in the real world for actual people. It's this sort of narrowing of the scope of who should get free and reduced school lunch, right? Mm-hmm. Even in Nevada, right? You talk about the ARP, right? All of this money that came in at the back end of COVID. And the state was able to use that to do universal free school breakfast and lunch for everyone and for every Nevada public school child. And right, that's something that has consequences. And now, right, Project 2025 says, well, actually, even the existing superstructure for free and reduced school lunch is too generous. So fewer children need that. And I mean, I guess it seems self-evident, but why does something like that matter?
It matters because, it's very rare that we get to take an issue completely off the table in public education. And this was an instance where we actually did, and it benefits students in numerous ways. We're always talking about the resources that students need. One of those resources is just food. And that's not really ever discussed a whole lot. Project 2025, what it wants to do is eliminate a provision that allows districts with 40% more students eligible for these programs to make it available to all students. This gets rid of the stigma. This gets rid of, the shame, or helps parents, balance the budgets a little bit more. There's numerous benefits to this program. But Project 2025 wants to basically just get rid of that. It calls on the next administration to just reject efforts to create universal school meals. And that's obviously bad for a host of reasons. But we did see this in Nevada. Unfortunately, Governor Lombardo vetoed Assembly Bill 319. I always like to point out, just in terms of priorities, on June 15th, he signed into law the stadium bill, right? We gave a billionaires money for a stadium. Then the next day, he literally vetoed the universal school meal bills. So if that's not his priorities in a nutshell, I'm not sure what is. We have a lot of students, not only in Nevada, but nationally, who face food insecurity. 1 in 5 students. A school meal might be the only 2 times a student's going to eat all day. And that if that doesn't break your heart, I don't know what will. So schools are the only place that these kids are getting food. This is an issue we saw again up close, which is why the veto was so just, unimaginable and heartbreaking. And probably one of the worst vetoes, because it literally took food out of kids' mouths. I think there's, again, another nice contrast today with the announcement of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who actually signed this bill into law this year because he understands that this is what our kids need to succeed. The quote I go back to that was in Project 2025 basically equates these programs to entitlements. Mm-hmm. And I think that's disgusting. You're basically saying that a student eating at a school is an entitlement program. And I don't know how anybody can say that with a straight face, and tell a hungry kid who might just be trying to take an apple away from school for her little brother and sister so that they have an extra snack at the end of the day. You're going to tell me that that's an entitlement program. And unfortunately, when you look at, the context of the Project 2025 and Lombardo's veto message, it's almost identical in terms of the language. So I know, folks give him the moderate label, but his veto message reads just like the sections of Project 2025. Both are discussing waste and inefficiency, and a return to normalcy as justification for taking food out of kids' mouths. We don't stand for that. I think, the benefits of implementing these programs are aside from just health and diet and nutrition, research shows that these programs reduce absenteeism, they improve student behaviors, it eliminates stigmas, and most importantly, it probably improves their students' ability to have a great outcome. And even Governor Lombardo issued a K-12 audit shortly after session that basically came back and said that was a huge mistake for the veto. And they basically called on all lawmakers to either continue or expand this program, because that's how good of an idea it is. And I'll say one more thing is, you can't claim to care about the education of our children while denying them the resources they need to learn. And food is a resource. And that's one of the worst things. So like you said, these are one of these things that you don't really think about a whole lot, but it's in there. And that's why it's so bad.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there is so much education stuff in Project 2025, much of it quite heinous. So I guess I'll give you an opportunity here. Quick speed round. What do the people need to know? I mean, what that just really struck you as outlandish, or just what are we even doing here?
Yeah, I think, from the top, we've already discussed the elimination of the program or the Department of Education. But I mean, everything from diverts resources from public schools to vouchers, guts civil rights programs, it dismantles Head Start, eliminates Title I funding, which helps a lot of our most vulnerable students. Student loans is another one. This is a plan that they want to drive up costs for student loan repayments. We've got a lot of educators take advantage of the SAVE program. This is basically going to require loan holders to pay even more every month. And, when you're getting rid of those kinds of programs that work really well, we've seen how well it works. If you're putting more money into people's pockets, that's a great thing. But I think the most important part, aside from getting rid of all that, just the umbrella is it creates a very clear binary choice between a Vice President Harris for running for president or a MAGA Trump running for president. You've got Harris, who will ensure our students have what they need to reach their potential. And then you've got Trump, who's going to demonize them and privatize our schools, let go our educators, and minimize access and opportunities to our kids. So as bad of a document as it is, it creates a very stark contrast between a Harris-Walz administration and a Trump-Vance administration.
Well, I think that's probably a great place to leave it. Alex Marks, Director of Strategy at NSEA, thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.